Hello, Matthew Bell with InsurancePrescription.com. Today I want to think about a situation that sometimes surprises people, and that is when they're sitting down with an insurance advisor and the insurance advisor starts to ask questions that they think lie, let's say, outside of the relevance to a question about actual insurance. This might be property and casualty. I'm sure it applies to that as well, but I'm thinking mainly in conversations about life insurance, maybe disability insurance, long-term care. So I thought what I would do is just kind of look at the question of why is the life insurance agent asking so many questions? Now, I should point out that I think this is what a good agent actually will do. So if you don't have a life insurance agent who is asking you all these questions, you might want to at least get a second opinion, unless it's questions that you know that person has answers to already from some other avenue. And I think that'll become a little clearer as to why I'm saying that a little further in. But first, let me talk about some of the questions that you might expect, and then some of the questions that you might not expect. So obviously, when a person sits down with you for the first time, it's going to be a collection of very basic information: your name, your phone number, your spouse's name, maybe your kids' names. Ages obviously are going to be relevant to the policies directly, so there's no big surprise there. They might ask you questions about what other policies you have in force, whether you have group insurance coverage, and so on. And none of these, again, are going to be very surprising to people. But the agent might also ask you about things like what legal instruments you have in place. Like, do you have a power of attorney? Do you have a will? Do you have a living trust? Person might ask you about veterans benefits. They might ask you about 529 plans or other college saving vehicles. And then something that kind of tends to throw people off initially is the agent might also ask you things about your retirement vehicles, about do you have a 401k, do you contribute to the 401k, what is your match? If not a 401k, it could be a 403b, a 457b, just some kind of an employer-sponsored plan. Person might ask you about any traditional IRAs, Roth IRAs, non-qualified vehicles that you might have. You might be asked about your savings account, checking account, money market accounts. Do you have additional things in a brokerage? Do you have separate mutual funds? Do you own stocks and bonds separately? Do you have interest in a company? Then there's going to be questions perhaps about your expected Social Security situation. What level of benefit do you expect? Are you receiving Social Security disability income? Do you have a pension? Do you have any expected inheritances coming your way? Then there are going to be some questions about your projections. What is it that you are actually concerned with? When do you plan to retire? How much money do you plan to want to spend in retirement for expenses, maybe for leisure activities? Is leaving a legacy of concern to you? Do you have children maybe or grandchildren that you want to try and provide for their education? Are you concerned with your own long-term care situation or the long-term care situation of somebody that you love? Are you concerned with protecting income maybe in the event of a disability? And on top of that, you're going to be asked in addition about various debts that you might have. What is the level of mortgage debt that you have? What is the amount of credit card debt that you have? Do you have vehicle loans, including for maybe a car, a boat? Do you have a second property? Do you have any other sources of income? So some of these questions are going to be questions, again, that you might expect a person who's selling life insurance or a person who's presenting life insurance products to you to ask. So for instance, about other coverages, maybe about the amount of money that you earn in a given year, about the amount of mortgage debt that you have, because these are going to be relevant, straightforwardly relevant in terms of just calculating the amount of insurance benefit that you might need. But other questions, it's probably not as clear. For example, how much are you contributing to your 401k? What's the match percent? And so on. Now there's a kind of a cynical view, and the cynical view is going to say, well, the life insurance agent is just trying to capture as much information as he or she can on you, and it's essentially going to be serving the purpose in terms of psychology to try to put you in a buying frame of mind because you don't share that information unless you trust somebody. And so in virtue of asking these questions, they're trying to build trust. And I'm sure for certain people that's going to be primary. Another way of thinking about it that's somewhat also cynical is going to be the idea that, well, the life insurance agent is trying to see where all the money's going, because when you come around at the very end and say, well, our budget doesn't allow for it, the agent's going to point out various ways in which you could stop spending so much on Starbucks, or you're over contributing to your 401k, or there's a number of different avenues. But there's also a more positive spin on it, a more positive way of understanding why these questions might be necessary to ask. To get at this, I'm going to present a doctor analogy. Let's start with the slogan, a prescription without a diagnosis or an evaluation constitutes malpractice. Now, this is just a slogan. I am not a legal advisor. This is not legal advice. I'm not a medical practitioner. I'm not a financial advisor. So all I'm saying here is just as a kind of a way of getting the gears turning in your mind. The idea is that you can't provide a recommendation without having performed a certain level of examination. A doctor is going to prescribe medication or prescribe therapy or prescribe surgery or some other intervention only after he or she has thoroughly examined you and has made his or her diagnosis. So the doctor has to determine what's wrong with you before the doctor can provide a prescription. Now, some cases you come to the doctor thinking something's wrong and having some idea about what might be wrong, or at least what your symptoms are. And in other cases, you just show up for a wellness visit and the doctor does some labs and notices that something's abnormal and starts to kind of probe. So there can be a number of things, a number of points of relevance in terms of that analogy. Now, I should say all analogies are going to tend to break down at some point, so you can't put too heavy an emphasis on the analogy. But the idea is that the life insurance agent is going to want to come into the household and just take stock of everything that you have in place, because it would be irresponsible for the agent to recommend certain policies or certain funding strategies if they're completely incompatible with other things that you have in place in your financial portfolio or in your retirement plan, if it's not in line with the budget. And so from at least the positive standpoint, the reason to try to gather this information is to make a responsible recommendation. Now, in the first place, that could be a responsible recommendation in terms of the products. So, for instance, a recommendation as to a term product maybe over a whole life product, or maybe a universal life product works better in this situation. So it might be product driven, but it might also be a recommendation, number two, just in terms of a procedure or some kind of a decision that you have to make with respect to a policy that you already own. So in other words, the agent is going to want to situate the recommendations that he or she makes in the context of other things that you have. So if you have a policy and you call an agent and you say, hey, I've been paying premiums on this policy for 20 years. I think I would like to cancel it, terminate it, cash it out. The agent, a responsible agent, is going to want to understand what your total picture is before he or she could endorse that. Now, of course, you're free to do whatever you like. You can call the agent, you could call the company, and if you want to surrender the policy, you may do so. But what the agent is going to try to determine is whether or not that makes sense for you. And it might make sense in your situation and it might not. And once again, there's a cynical way of approaching this and a non-cynical way. So the cynical way would be, well, of course, the agent's going to try and find a reason to tell me to keep the policy. But in some cases, maybe the agent's not even getting paid for that policy. Maybe that agent didn't put the policy in place. The agent, him or herself, will suffer no loss if you cash it in, and they'll experience no gain if you keep the policy. But ideally, what they're trying to make the determination of is whether it makes sense given the total constellation of things that you have in place. Now, in this regard, you might want to understand that the recommendations that are given are really only as good as the information that the insurance agent gets. Having said that, obviously there's different levels of skill, different levels of expertise that agents have, so certain agents are going to see more given the information that you provide, but nevertheless, the more information you provide, the more the agent has to work with when making his or her recommendations for you. Now, a couple of caveats. I should say that the insurance agent is certainly not the only one who's going to want to have that information. If you sit down with a financial planner, if you sit down with your money manager, almost for sure he or she is going to request information about life policies, and it's going to be for somewhat of the same reason. So whereas the life insurance agent is going to be primarily, let's say, focused on the life insurance aspect, he or she wants to know what's in place in other areas because that's going to help inform recommendations. Likewise, a financial planner is going to want to know what is in place, or a money manager is going to want to know what is in place in an insurance portfolio, simply because, once again, even though he or she is focused on a different aspect of your portfolio, nevertheless, the information you provide with respect to the insurance portion of your portfolio is going to have relevance to the recommendations that are given in the other area. Now, I do have a video where I talk about the 4 different advisors that you're going to want to speak to in order to plan a good retirement and in order to make sure your retirement plans are on track. Now, I'm not going to get into that here, but it kind of fits in because all these people, maybe a lawyer, maybe an accountant, you've got money manager, they are going to want to have a complete picture in order to make the most responsible and the best recommendation for your situation. Now, of course, there's an asterisk. Every recommendation not only is going to be based on the information, but it's also going to be predicated on a certain set of assumptions that that advisor has. So different advisors may come from different perspectives, and you should at least be aware that that's possibly the case. You should try and find the perspective that maybe gels more with your particular needs, desires, trajectory, but also you'd want to make that determination based on the level of trust that you have and rapport that you have with a particular advisor. I can't really comment on that here. But what I was aiming to do is just kind of give you a little bit of background information in terms of why that life insurance agent might be asking more questions than you really think are relevant. And part of it is that he or she has been trained in order, ideally, he or she has been trained in order to recognize the relevance of the information that you're being asked. So if you provide it, it's just going to help inform the recommendation, best case scenario. And if you don't trust the agent enough to provide it, it might be time to look for a new agent. Thank you so much for watching. If you found something of use in this video, I ask that you please like it, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it becomes available. If you think that the video is worth sharing, you know somebody who might be interested in the content, I ask you to please do that as well, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thank you so much.